Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Galatia Strong. I'm a physical therapist who got a 100% on my NPTE, and this led me to co-found SPT with me, which is an NPTE prep course. If you enjoy what you see and you're studying for the NPTE, check us out at sptwithme.com. Now, for what you're actually here for, let's talk about cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve. In this image, this is a depiction of the anterior to posterior view of the thalamus and brainstem. Here you can see that the trigeminal nerve exits the brainstem at the level of the pons ventrolaterally. This is a posterior to anterior view of the thalamus and brainstem, so we are looking at the back side. You cannot see the nerve from this view because, again, it exits ventrally. This is the same exact view as the previous image. We're looking at the back side. However, this image includes the nuclei. So you can see where the nuclei of both the motor and sensory portions of the trigeminal nerve are. As you can see, the trigeminal nerve, the motor nucleus, is more localized into one area versus there being several sensory nuclei that actually cover quite a large stretch of area. The trigeminal sensory nuclear complex consists of 3 nuclei: the mesencephalic, chief sensory, and spinal trigeminal nuclei. These will all end up sending tracts from the body to the brain at the primary somatosensory cortex. The motor has information from the brain to send to the muscles. So just consider ascending pathways versus descending pathways. These images are a schematic of a transverse cut of the brainstem. I show you this because this really helps to show that there are 3 sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, as mentioned before. They're all at different regions along and within the brainstem. Here you can see that the mesencephalic nucleus is the most superior. Then inferiorly we have the chief sensory nucleus. And then at the very bottom, most inferiorly, we have the spinal trigeminal nucleus. Sensory. So we're going back on this image for a second because I want you to understand that this view is on different planes. If you look at the pons and you consider the transverse cuts on them, as you go up and down, you'll notice that the shape of the pons is different. The size of the pons is different. So just understand that we are literally at different levels, superior versus inferior, when we are talking about the different nuclei. Here is a lateral view of the thalamus and brainstem, same structure as before. Here you can see how the trigeminal nerve exits, again, at the level of the pons and the ventrolateral aspect of it. Before we get started into getting more into the pathway, let's talk about the many things that the trigeminal nerve does. This is definitely one of the more hefty, material-based cranial nerves. But let's break it down and let's see if we can make it simple. So this nerve happens to be more challenging because it has 2 functions. It's both a sensory and a motor nerve. So with its sensory function, it provides sensation from the face, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, as well as the meninges. Specifically for the face, it provides information about the sensation of pain, touch, temperature, proprioception, vibration. So this kind of rings a bell. The anterolateral pathways, the DCML pathways. Now the trigeminal nerve has pathways that are analogous to this. They do not actually converge with these pathways, but they are so incredibly similar to these pathways. It's just within itself. With respect to the tongue, this nerve does not provide sensation of taste. It is not a special sensory nerve. What this nerve does is it provides sensation that something is touching the tongue, specifically at the anterior 2/3 of it. And then one more thing that I want to point out is that sensation is also felt at the cornea. This is important because this is actually one of those things that we can test as a physical therapist to see if there's something going on with the trigeminal nerve. So, whether or not a person can actually feel if someone happens to touch the cornea of their eye with a feather or even a finger. So that is sensory. One thing I want you to consider is direction. Sensory means that we are getting information from the body, from an external cue. So in this case, the tongue, the face, etc. This information is then going to be sent through the nerve to the brainstem, then ultimately to the brain. So keep this in mind whenever you're looking at nerve pathways and routes on images, and consider the direction that information is traveling. So onto the motor portion of this nerve. Here the information is being sent to the opposite way. So from the brain, then to the nerve, and then to the muscle. The trigeminal nerve innervates the muscles of mastication, along with some other muscles like the tensor tympani muscle, which is a muscle within the middle ear. And if you don't know what it does, this muscle actually serves to dampen loud sounds, such as those produced from chewing, those heard from shouting, or things like thunder. There are other muscles that it innervates as well, such as the tensor veli palatini. This is one that actually helps to regulate air pressure within our middle ear. We also have innervation to the mylohyoid, which is a muscle that has the function to elevate our hyoid bone, allowing us to swallow and speak and support the tongue. Then lastly, it also innervates the anterior belly of the digastric muscle, and this serves to depress the mandible as well as also elevating the hyoid bone. Let's talk about the route that the trigeminal nerve takes. So clearly, it's a very hefty image, but let's try to make it as simple as possible. Now, first thing I want you to note is all of the different colors that you see on this image. And just for now, I am not talking about the colors of the lines like the nerves. I'm talking about the colors of green and blue and purple and yellow. These are with respect to the sections that receive information. So what I mean by this is that if you look at the yellow section, you will see that C2 is the nerve that receives all the information from this area. So think about the occipital area. Of course, in this video, we are not talking about C2. So everything else that's in this picture is what the trigeminal nerve gets information from. Now you'll see there are 3 extra colors representative of 3 different sections within the trigeminal nerve. And this is because the trigeminal nerve branches out into 3 different branches. Their respective names are the ophthalmic nerve, aka V1, maxillary, V2, and V3, the mandibular nerve. Again, all these are going to get sensory information from these respective areas of the face and then ultimately send that information to the brain. Now this image hopefully makes the previous image look a little bit more simple. Obviously, you can see that there's an additional color on here. It's red. It shows that it's labeled cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10. Don't worry about that right now. That is not what we're focusing on. We are obviously on cranial nerve number 5. The ones that I want you to care about for this video are V1, V2, and V3. That's all labeled here. All of these are part of the trigeminal nerve. Now, going back to this picture, I now want you to pay attention to the lines, so the nerves. So as you can see, the branches of the sensory aspect of the trigeminal nerve, they're all branched out all over the place. Like I mentioned before, think about the direction of sensory input. It comes from the body, then to the central nervous system. So you're going to see these nerve root endings, they're at the face. So for example, you look at the nerve root endings at V1. Take all those nerves, they're all going to combine eventually, going to the trigeminal ganglion in Meckel's cave. Then they're going to the trigeminal sensory nuclei, which is in the brainstem, and this information will then be sent to the primary somatosensory cortex. Same idea goes with the information that's received within the V2 distribution. Same idea with the V3 distribution, the mandibular distribution. So trigeminal nerves gets all the sensory information from different parts of the face, temperature, pain, vibration, things like that. Now also remember, this trigeminal nerve also receives information from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue as well. Now this image is still going off the idea of the sensory aspect of the trigeminal nerve. So we've talked about information coming from the skin, then traveling to the brain. In this image, we are showing where it is reached in the brainstem. Remember that there are multiple nuclei, 3 in particular, mesencephalic, chief, and spinal nuclei. Each of these nuclei receive very specific pieces of sensory information from each of the respective locations. And I'm going to show you what I mean in the next slide. So this is exactly what I mean. The mesencephalic nucleus is going to receive all of the proprioceptive information. It comes from V1, V2, V3, so the entirety of what the face feels. The chief nucleus is going to get all of the information regarding fine touch. V1, V2, V3, they all converge. Additionally, this specific one gets information about dental pressure as well. Then lastly, the spinal nucleus is going to get information from V1, V2, V3 about crude touch, pain, and temperature. All the information is going to gather and get sent to the brain with their respective tracks. Just to get into it a little bit more, this image shows you how the information is sent from the nuclei to the brain. You can see some tracts cross over to the contralateral side, while some tracts continue to ascend ipsilaterally until it then reaches the primary somatosensory cortex. Now, finally, we are going to talk about the motor aspect of the trigeminal nerve. There's just so much information about this nerve. Now, since the information is sent from the brain downwards, let's look at the nucleus first. The nucleus is in the pons. This is that orange line. So you're going to notice it starts there. It's then going to travel ventrally until it reaches the trigeminal ganglion. Then after that, we reach the destinations, which are the muscles that are innervates. Now, I do want you to notice something. Take a look at where I circled. This exit point shows that the motor nerve is part of the V3 mandibular section of the trigeminal nerve. So V3 is not only a sensory section, it's a motor section as well. The V1 and V2 branches are only sensory. The V3 is both sensory and motor. You're going to see that the temporalis muscle is innervated, and it is actually in the V1 section. However, because the nerve originates in the V3 section, it's considered as part of the mandibular V3 section for the trigeminal nerve. So you'll see that the nerve just happens to travel superiorly to reach the temporalis. So motor-wise, the nerve innervates the muscles of mastication. So what kind of tests can we do to check whether or not the trigeminal nerve is working properly? Well, if we know what the functions are, all we have to do is test them. So first of all, let's talk about sensation. We know the functions of sensation. We know that it's pain, temperature, touch, right? Vibration, things like that. So what we can do is have the person close their eyes. We can get a cotton ball, pinprick. We can test hot versus cold. And we can assess it at the 3 different distributions, V1, V2, V3. Maybe they're all working. Maybe only a few of them are working. A couple of them are working. V1 isn't working, etc. Another thing that we could test sensation-wise is the corneal reflex. As I mentioned before, the trigeminal nerve provides the cornea sensation, all right? Specifically, the distribution of V1, the ophthalmic nerve. So the way that we could test this is by essentially poking a person's cornea. Now, I mentioned that it's a reflex, right? So there has to be a motor component as well as a sensation component. Obviously, like I've mentioned before, V1, ophthalmic, it is sensation only. So you poke someone's cornea. If the sensation works, it's going to then elicit that motor contraction, the motor input. Again, trigeminal nerve has nothing to do with the motor input. So you're kind of testing multiple things at once. But let's say that V1 is not working and there's no input into the spinal cord, then the reflex will not occur. So it's kind of up to us to see whether or not it's the motor distribution that's not working, that other nerve that is providing that motor input, or if it's the sensory distribution that is not allowing that reflex to occur. So you have to do a couple tests. However, if both are working properly, then we know that it's fine. So next up, we have to test the motor aspects of what the trigeminal nerve does. The masseter and the temporalis are usually the ones that we test because they're big and bulky and you can pretty easily palpate them compared to the other nerves that the trigeminal nerve innervates. For me, I just couldn't really imagine myself trying to palpate the tensor tympani muscle. But if you have the person mimic biting and mastication, you're going to be able to see whether or not these muscles can fire. Hopefully the trigeminal nerve is a little bit more manageable now. Check us out at sptwithme.com when you're studying for the NPTE. Here are some references if you would like more information.